Welcome to Forum. I'm Alexis Madrigal. There are many ways one could approach the topic of food writer John Birdsall's new book, What is Queer Food? A kid's version with a rainbow of queer hero chefs, a playful cookbook sourced from an army of gay line cooks and lesbian farmers, a ponderous history detailing the fortunes of Castro restaurants. But in form alone, none of these straight-ahead approaches would be right. This book moves through time and across the breadth of the big tent queer world, and it does so with funny, lusty, unbounded creativity. This book is hungry and thirsty. It is about quiche and AIDS, about the tortures of concealment and the ecstasies of revelation, the rewards of truth, and Richard Olney in tighty-whities serving country food on a hot French afternoon. And perhaps it goes without saying, but this book is tethered to our region, to the Bay, to San Francisco, in ways that cannot be undone. In the long arc of this particular liberation struggle, our streets, our corners, our little restaurants, they are main characters in the drama of a community's becoming. John Birdsall, thank you so much for this book, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be sharing this book, and especially sharing it with the Bay Area, because as you say, it was really born in San Francisco.
Yeah. Let's start, though, with brioche. Who was this tender-hearted, brioche-loving middle schooler? Like, tell me all his secrets.
So I grew up in a suburb of San Francisco, and my mom had a collection of cookbooks.
Wait, which one? Which one? Come on.
It was Belmont, down on the peninsula.
Okay.
And yeah, my mom had this collection of cookbooks that she would, dip into on Sundays and special occasions. And the one that she dipped into a lot was this huge volume. It was Craig Claiborne's New York Times cookbook, which was impressive, sort of Bible thick. It seemed important. It sort of declared its importance. And it had some black and white photographs scattered through it. And even though my mom never made brioche, I was struck, arrested, fascinated, intrigued by this one photo of a table for two, nobody sitting at the table, and there was a brioche with its, shiny top knot at each place, and a glass of orange juice embedded in crushed ice. And the caption
brioche.
Was, yes, here brioche is shown for a breakfast. It seemed the most sophisticated thing that probably I had ever seen, certainly in a cookbook. I wanted to know everything about it, but the thing that haunted me was, who was the table set for? Like, where were the people who were supposed to be having this kind of elegant breakfast? And the fact that they were absent sort of, as I say, haunted me. It was the absence of these people, and somehow I knew that they were men. I knew that it wasn't, a couple. It wasn't going to be a woman in a bathrobe. It was going to be two men. And I don't even know how I knew that. It was just a kind of insistence that was within me to have some reality that was starting to dawn on me as I was starting to recognize my own sexuality, to have that reality echoed. It was kind of appropriate, maybe, that there were these two men who I imagined, who I knew were going to break into this brioche, were not pictured.
I mean, but what a lovely flash forward. What a lovely vision of what a life could be, a happy version of it, not a tragic one.
Yeah, and I have to say that, growing up in Beaumont, sort of our essentially next door neighbors across this little canyon, the house we could see, were a gay couple, Pat and Lou, who became as close to me as my uncles, even closer. I called them Uncle Pat and Uncle Lou, and they were a gay couple who had moved to the San Francisco Bay Area from the Midwest, and they bought this, suburban house. They were shunned by most of the neighbors on our block, but my mom and dad loved them, and so we were. I was treated to, evenings at Pat and Lou's with my parents. They would have cocktails together. We were invited to parties. They had friends from San Francisco, and this is like in the late 1960s. They had friends from San Francisco who would come down for parties. I'd be allowed to sort of be there as a 7 or 8-year-old boy for the first hour maybe before I was hustled home, probably before the real party started. But it was this kind of magical situation that I had never, none of my school friends, certainly their parents were not like this. And this was this enchanted world that I felt like I was on the brink of seeing and mostly kind of feeling the emotion of, feeling the happiness, the joy, the, I guess, slightly naughty quality of this household, these men, the food that they cooked, the food that they shared, which was so unlike the food that my mom cooked, this sort of practical, nutritious food. I mean, I don't know if they ever ate brioche, but they would have been, I would have been surprised if they hadn't, because it was kind of fabulousness and joy that had been translated into food.
Right, and I mean, they actually are crucial to the origin story of this book, right? They appear in this essay that you wrote in 2013 for the food magazine, dearly departed food magazine, Lucky Peach,
yes,
in which
R.I.P.
it was Lou's Burgers, right? That were maybe your first encounter with this idea of this kind of sensuous food that went beyond home economics and that could be called queer food in some sense.
Yes. These burgers that, no responsible adult would think of feeding, like a 9-year-old boy. They were impossible to digest. They were, rich, sort of gilded with Dijon mustard and caramelized onions, and just enormous. And, not only the fact that I had been able to see, taste, experience, feel this food, but the fact also, which I only could piece together later, was that essentially exactly a month before the Stonewall Uprising in June 1969, so in May 1969, my Uncle Pat had this heart attack at age 39, which killed him. And this world that I knew, this kind of swirling world that was fed with such delicious things, just suddenly disappears. Pat's family from St. Louis descends, essentially takes everything. Lou had to sell the house. He moved away. We saw him less and less. And so I kind of grew up, especially as I realized my own sexuality and came out, I grew up with this sense that all of this was fragile, that this whole world that had seemed so fundamental to me could be erased so easily by this culture, society, world of power beyond it. And so much of my writing, especially since that 2013 essay in Lucky Peach, has been driven by this sense that it's my responsibility to illuminate this world, to piece together this world that had been erased, that had been disappeared from the culture and from families' personal lives, families who couldn't deal with their relatives' sexuality.
So answering the title of the book, obviously, took 12, 13 years here.
Right, yeah.
So let's start with a slightly easier sub-question in the book, also pandered as the locals here. What was, as you put it, arguably the first queer restaurant in America?
I would say, well, I would place that right there in San Francisco, called the Paper Doll. And the Paper Doll opens in 1944 in North Beach in a little alley called Cadell Place, which is not too far from Union Square, but also weirdly hidden from it. And the Paper Doll opens in 1944. It has a straight owner, Thomas Arbulich. And for a couple of years, it kind of runs as a neighborhood bar in North Beach. And then Thomas Arbulich sort of hands the bar to this woman named Mona Sargent, who was the proprietor, also straight, but the proprietor of the most famous lesbian bar in San Francisco at the time, Mona's. And as one observer put it at the time, Mona just kind of turns it on as a gay bar. I think the interesting thing for me was how the paper doll kind of enforced this sense of respect for gay and lesbian patrons, and it would allow people to present themselves, to dress, to wear makeup, to wear their hair in a certain way that was unacceptable on the street. So the paper doll was sort of this safe haven. It was a bar and restaurant. The food was pretty basic, but for the 1940s, it had a kind of luxury about it. You know, it was prime rib and roast chicken. And it became a place where everyone went. A lot of gay and lesbian bars, especially lesbian bars in San Francisco at the time, also operated as tourist attractions. You know, San Francisco still had that reputation, the glow of the old Barbary Coast, and tourists who came in the 1940s and 1950s wanted to experience a bit of that. So straight tourists would be welcomed into places like Mona's even, where they would see drag shows, you know, drag kings and drag queens. And it was, you know, it was something to sort of giggle over, to gawk at. But the paper doll didn't become a tourist stop, didn't become a stop on the Gray Line tour, as one regular claimed, that it was really for us, meaning queer people. And you know, there's an early diary of Susan Sontag's. She's an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, and she crosses the bay to go to the paper doll. And she's kind of astounded. She declares how the servers, you know, the women servers are very cute, and they all dress as men, you know. And there was this, you know, places like New York City, there was this rule in bars, you know, that would be rated, that Audre Lorde talks about this in the 1950s, that, you know, you had to wear at least 3 pieces of clothing that were deemed appropriate to your gender, or else you would get arrested.
And the paper doll said no. We're talking with food writer John Birdsall about his new book, What is Queer Food? How We Served a Revolution. We'll be back with more right after the break.
Support for KQED podcasts comes from Earth Justice. As a national legal nonprofit, Earth Justice has more than 200 full-time lawyers who fight for a healthy environment. They wield the power of the law to protect people's health, preserve magnificent places and wildlife, and advance clean energy to combat climate change. Earth Justice fights in court because the earth needs a good lawyer. Learn more about how you can get involved and become a supporter at earthjustice.org.
Welcome back to Forum. Alexis Madrigal here. We're talking with food writer John Birdsall about his new book, What is Queer Food? How We Served a Revolution. He's also the author of The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard. He's also won a couple of James Beard awards for his culture and food writing. Of course, we want to hear from you too. What's this conversation bringing up for you? How has food helped you connect within the queer community? You know the number. It's 866-733-6786. That's 866-733-6786. You can email your comments, your questions, your remembrances of the paper doll. That'd be amazing if someone has one out there. To forum@kqed.org, or you can find us on social media, Blue Sky, Instagram, etc. So before we get into a couple of the specific foods that you talk about in this book, and I know that you've begun to answer this question by opening up the paper doll as a place of community and connection. You have to answer the dreaded question, which is the question in the title of your book.
Yeah.
What is queer food? Very difficult. Obviously took a book to answer it.
Yeah. And, you know, I partly titled my book, What is Queer Food, sort of as a challenge to myself, to sort of answer that question. You know, since that 2013 piece I wrote on Lucky Peach, America, Your Food is So Gay, you know, almost every interviewer would ask me, you know, what is it? What is gay food? You know, is it, you know, is it this? Is it that? Is it, you know, protein shakes because so many gay men go to the gym? And, you know, the challenge for me to answer that question before I begin to answer it for you, I have to go way back to talk about the inspiration, the person who even put that question in my mind, which is when I was cooking in San Francisco in the 1980s in restaurants. I started writing food pieces for an LGBTQ weekly called The Sentinel. And The Sentinel had this kind of pioneering arts coverage in the 1980s under this great arts editor, Eric Hellman. And, instead of just writing about restaurants in the Castro, Eric invited me to move beyond the Castro, to write about restaurants citywide, but to keep this question in my mind. What is there a gay sensibility of food? And if there is, what would that look like? What would that taste like? How could you describe it? And so even long after I stopped writing for The Sentinel, that question really hounded me. And so, what is queer food? I mean, what is queer food is a culture and not a cuisine. Queer food is queered, you could say, by intention, by context, heavily by context. It could be by subverting traditional gender roles. I tell this story in my book of Shahar Zahav, which was a Reform Jewish community that formed in San Francisco in the 1970s. And there are great reports of their first Rosh Hashanah meal feast in 1978, which Harvey Milk attended a few months before his assassination. But what was astounding to this mid-century generation who'd grown up in really traditional families was that for this Rosh Hashanah, the men did all the cooking and serving, and the women said the prayers, blew the shofar. And for that generation, this was astonishing. And so even though the meal consisted of really traditional dishes, the brisket, the apple cake that everyone had grown up with in Jewish households, the fact that they had subverted gender roles, queered this food, it becomes, it's like this magic moment, this sort of magical transformation when this same food becomes queered because of intention, because of the experience of these people who had known food and known these dishes in very different circumstances. So, and as you see the 20th century develop, as the queer civil rights movement really picks up steam, you see these generations using food in ways to proclaim identity, to push back against erasure, to push back against discrimination, and really embracing certain foods as our own, our meaning queer, and making them visible in the public. There had been a long tradition, especially in the early 20th century, of queer people coming together, celebrating over food, building community over food, but in places where they couldn't be public, house parties with the blinds closed or in bars with painted over windows. And so there's this incredible exuberance, in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1960s, and especially after Stonewall, for food to come out, as it were, to proclaim its queerness, to proclaim its essential nature in queer identity and community formation. And that's what I really wanted to focus on. It's not about specific dishes, although there are certainly iconic dishes that have expressed queerness at various times in our history, but this idea of coming out, eating food in queer spaces in public, being seen in public, opening restaurants, opening queer restaurants, ones perhaps inspired by the paper doll and even beyond, proclaiming queerness in ways that residents of the paper doll couldn't have imagined in the 1940s.
You also do trace a couple of, I guess I want to say, like kind of intellectual strains or just sort of historical movements within what you're calling queer food. I guess you say, this is just reading back to you from your book, these kind of two strains of queer identity building at the table, the egalitarian and communal, more interested in collectivity than purity of cuisine, versus the Epicurean and hedonistic, the cliche of the politically and ethically grounded lesbian vegetarian potluck versus the cliche of the glittering gay dinner party. And those two things do seem quite far apart on whatever dimension of the world that is. But they are united by a way of building community, right? I mean, there's some deeper connection between them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what struck me in doing my research was how those ideas really declare themselves in this series of salons, really, that took place over a 9-month period in 1956 in Paris with James Baldwin and Richard Olney, who would, in the 1970s, write these really iconic cookbooks, French cookbooks. And in those salons, which were just these sprawling affairs, they called them Saturday Night Function, named for this Duke Ellington stomp that's threatens to sort of spin out of control this music. And in the same way, these salons, which would start on Friday night and end on Monday mornings with food, smoking, lots of drinking, talking, how you really start to see how this divergence presents itself. We think of Baldwin as someone who had this robust food life, but he was much more interested in expressing this empathy circle, bringing people to the table, calling people to the table, calling allies, friends, lovers to the table. The nature of the food is not so important. And on the other end of the scale, you have Richard Olney, who is working on this project in the 1950s of sort of queering escoffier, of taking these classic French dishes and also very rustic French dishes and turning them into stages for queer performance. You mentioned at the top, Olney in his tighty-whities in his house in the south of France, entertaining guests on the terrace, including Alice Waters, who was tremendously influenced by Olney. But this sense of being seen, of turning food not only into this Epicurean experience, but into this performative experience where we, meaning gay men, queer people, are flaunting everything that's inside us, all of the exuberance, all of the ways that we're transforming culture and transforming society with food, focusing on pleasure, focusing on the taste and the aroma of food, something which Americans in the mid-20th century were very uncomfortable with. We still had this very sort of Calvinist idea that food should be muted, that food should be about nutrition and about budgets, not about this experience that expressed joy and exuberance in the world. So I do think, it's a cliche to say that there are those two strains, but they, and of course they coexist. They cross lines, they cross over. But these are two ways where a queer voice in food, a queer voice in the kitchen, in restaurants, in dining rooms, really do start to assert themselves.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring in a first caller here. Let's bring in Barry in San Francisco. Welcome, Barry.
Hey, Alexis, thanks for taking my call. When I was younger and had just arrived in San Francisco in the late 80s, in the early 90s, there was a breakfast joint in Lower Haight called a Beehive. And what was wonderful about it, and it wasn't the food was just okay, but it was this place that all the servers were drag queens, or one of them was Jerome Kaya, the artist. And what was really fun about it was he got sassed, and it was very performative because the way the food was delivered and who delivered it was part of the fun, but the main thing was that it was a place in the middle of an AIDS epidemic when the whole community, every week, there'd be literally tons of obituaries in the newspaper, the BAR, and then there was this place, among many, where we had fun and we could exist as gay and lesbian and transgender people and just sort of enjoy something and have a relief. And I remember that really fondly because It was in Lower Haight, and just like east of Fillmore Street on the south side, and it was wonderful. It was this great place, and maybe the author remembers it. But thank you for letting me just describe that place.
No,
How
thank
fun
you,
it was.
Barry.
Yeah, I don't specifically remember the Beehive. I must have known about it at the time, but I think one of the huge queer innovations was visibility. Billy West opened Zuni Cafe in San Francisco in 1979, and he's really inspired by restaurants in Provincetown. And it was important to Billy to have his restaurant sited sort of at the edge of the Castro. So it wasn't a restaurant that, because a lot of restaurants in the Castro kind of existed in this gay ghetto where, they were clearly in gay zones and there were all these expectations about them. But Billy was very proud that his restaurant was close to City Hall. And so once the restaurant took off, he knew the importance of having servers who were gay and let you know it through their just presentation. Servers who were gay, there were other servers who were not, but it was this sense of here at the heart of San Francisco power was a restaurant where you were being served this amazing food by clearly gay waiters, and that was an important step toward visibility, and especially, as you mentioned, during the AIDS crisis, when there was so much fear and misinformation, this irrational fear that you could perhaps be infected by a drop of sweat from a waiter that fell into your food. This was a real declaration of our power and our resilience.
You have a section in the book. Many people know the restaurant Zuni, absolutely legendary, longtime San Francisco restaurant. I didn't know that there was a tradition during the period Barry's talking about that was Mondays at Zuni. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Zuni, of course, like every other restaurant in San Francisco in the 1980s and 1990s was hugely impacted by the AIDS epidemic. I remember Vince Calcagno, the co-owner of Zuni Cafe, telling me that I think, in that period, 24 Zuni employees had passed away as a result of AIDS. And in this period, Zuni and other restaurants, they tended to be closed. They tended to be dark on Mondays. But Zuni started this tradition of holding memorials on Monday nights at Zuni for friends and lovers who had passed away because of the AIDS epidemic. They could be people directly related to the restaurant, or they could be the loved ones or friends of regular customers. But people would gather in the restaurant. There'd be margaritas or champagne, a few snacks, and people would stand up and eulogize their lovers who had passed. It's incredibly moving to me. Someone who grew up in restaurants in San Francisco, essentially. I started my first cooking job at Green's in San Francisco in 1983. At Fort Mason. The same time I was coming out. So my experience of coming out in San Francisco happened at the same time that I was becoming part of restaurant families. I was learning to cook. And so there's something incredibly powerful to me about being at a restaurant on the nights when it's closed, when all the usual hubbub, all the usual magic is gone. You're really aware of the smells of a closed restaurant, the buzz of the coolers. And it's this sense that, restaurants exist to nurture us, to give us pleasure and delight. And that same thing was happening in a very different context in places like Zuni when there were memorials for people who had passed. Food could also become something that could carry the force of eulogy, that could underline our sense of community, even at a time of tremendous sorrow when many of us were pulling back from these queer lives that we had established for ourselves in the city a time of deep mourning. And restaurants like Zuni, like others, could adapt to this time and still offer comfort to those of us who would have been celebrating in these same places on other nights.
Absolutely. We're talking with the food writer John Birdsall about his new book, What is Queer Food? How We Served a Revolution. Birdsall is also the author of The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard. Just to be clear, James Beard was gay, right? And so obviously this has been a theme in this work for a while, and James Beard also arises in this book as well. John has won 2 James Beard Awards for his culture and food writing. And of course, we want to wrap you into this conversation as well. In what ways do you consider food queer? Do you think there's such a thing as queer food? Or what does it mean to you? What's this conversation bring up? Or maybe you remember some of the places like Barry did, the Beehive there in the Lower Haight. We are going to get to quiche. When we get back, Noel on the Discord writes, whatever happened to quiche? I remember the joke in the 1980s, real men don't eat quiche, and it turns out that has like the nastiest history, which we will hear about when we come back. I'm Alexis Madrigal. Stay tuned for more with John Birdsall when we come back. Welcome back to Forum, joined by John Birdsall. He's got a new book out called What is Queer Food? How We Served a Revolution, and it is time to talk about quiche. I have been waiting. This is one of these fascinating topics where you sort of, as a kid, I sort of picked up a bunch of cultural accretions about quiche, but had no idea of the actual real history. So what is how did quiche become what it is?
So I have to say that in the research for my book, what really led me to quiche, I was doing some searching in digital archives, and I found this contact sheet of Andy Warhol in the Andy Warhol collection at Stanford. And it's a contact sheet of Andy and someone else arriving at Truman Capote's apartment in New York City in the 1970s. Obviously, they've arrived for lunch. And Truman, this is a really difficult time for Truman. He'll die a few years later. And he's been pretty much racked by, writer's block, alcoholism. But you see Truman welcoming them, and he's welcoming them with this enormous, gorgeous, luscious-looking quiche. He probably took a taxi to La Côte Basque and bought this quiche and brought it back, and he's just beaming. It's not the Truman that we know from Studio 54 and a big fedora and sunglasses. He's kind of his face is sort of naked. But, through this obviously difficult time, he's just beaming over this quiche that he's going to serve to Andy Warhol. And it struck me that quiche is pretty much the most expressive food of queer emotion and queer power that kind of develops in the 1970s and 1980s. Americans before the 1940s were not likely to know quiche unless they traveled to France a lot. It was an exotic, unusual, luxurious dish, quiche Lorraine. It becomes popular in broad American kind of gourmet circles. And then it really falls out of fashion. It becomes this kind of unloved thing. It's kind of, déclassé by the 1960s. But of course, gay people, we are masters at finding discarded stuff, an old sofa on the sidewalk and taking it home and making it amazing, making it fabulous. And that's kind of what happens to quiche. If you look at the archives of the Bay Area Reporter, the Gay Weekly in San Francisco, you find all of these celebrations that happen, and they're fueled by quiche, so there might be fundraisers in bars, wet jockstrap contests, and Leatherman contests. And the draw really is that, you get a fat slice of quiche Lorraine.
Is that really the draw, John?
Well, maybe it will sort of fuel your appreciation of, the wet jockstrap contest. But it also then becomes this incredibly expressive thing. You kind of see quiche adapting within different subcommunities in queer culture. I have this self-published cookbook that was done in 1980 by these two lesbians who lived in San Francisco, and they had a shitty apartment where they had a glimpse of Castro Street from their apartment, and they have this recipe for Castro Corner quiche, they call it. And it's a very different quiche than the sort of quiche Lorraine that was happening in leather bars. And this is, vegetarian broccoli quiche, with a salad oil crust. There's this wonderful drag queen who's popular in San Francisco and LA in the 1980s named Billy Gordon, and Billy has a cookbook called "You've Had Worse Things in Your Mouth," and Billy Gordon sort of adapts quiche Lorraine. She calls it quiche Luanda. It's this real assertion of identity, power, pleasure, enjoyment. Of course, quiche becomes the draw at brunch, which becomes this essentially gay weekly party. Weekend brunch is something where we assert our new identity, where we're remaking, socializing, remaking, partying, remaking the family, as it were.
And of course, that's followed by this nasty reaction, a sort of surprise hit book called Real Men Don't Eat Quiche.
Yeah, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche is published in 1982. The author is Bruce Firestein. Parts of it, appeared in Playboy magazine. And, it's a pushback against this new, quote unquote, soft masculinity, of the Jimmy Carter era. And it's also this incredibly homophobic attack on quiche. And it becomes a bestseller, unexpectedly, I guess. And it also becomes this vehicle for the broader culture to kind of reassert homophobia. You have these sort of national newspaper columnists, who now have permission to go, ask a gay hairdresser if, he serves quiche. And it's just kind of dripping with...
Nothing has made me want to eat quiche more than reading about that book and its reception in 1982.
It's just, this sort of toxic book that's sort of dressed up in what a later generation would call politically incorrect humor. So it was, it sort of allows the culture to reassert the patriarchy, to reassert itself. Phyllis Schlafly, the famous anti-feminist in Washington, when something like 50 or 52 senators, U.S. senators, declare that they're open to passing the Equal Rights Amendment, Phyllis Schlafly sends each one of them a quiche, as if to say, you're not real men, if you support the rights of women. So it is this just really kind of dark inflection, to a community, queer community that is finding its voice, that is finding its power, before AIDS sort of changes the calculation for everyone. Real Men Don't Eat Quiche becomes this weapon of the patriarchy to kind of push back on this new enlightened culture that's been forming. I mentioned starting to cook at Green's Restaurant in 1983. Deborah Madison, who founded the restaurant, who's amazing, tons of respect for her. We essentially would serve various quiche at the restaurant, but we weren't allowed to call it that. It called it savory tarts because quiche had been so debased broadly in the culture.
Let's bring in Tony in San Francisco. Welcome, Tony.
Hi there. Just wanted to thank the guests for bringing this to the forefront. At least today, it was a total surprise listening to the show, and it harked back to me very emotionally to a period of my life as a child. I grew up in a restaurant here in San Francisco, thanks to my granddad and uncle, who my grand aunts. There were two sisters actually from Chile that came and started a restaurant here. But they were compelled by their son, or in this case, Gabriel, who was unfortunately, he was taken too early. He died at 33, taken by the AIDS pandemic, and but he was always such a beautiful host. Really, kind of was the front of house for this restaurant, and really just came to life every day that he was at this restaurant, and his community that supported him, and of course his mother and our family, that just also kind of found comfort and refuge in this small restaurant, or a few down the line, and it just struck me in such a way that I'm getting a little emotional right now. But we miss him dearly, and I just really appreciate that a restaurant and the comfort of food, the hospitality, the human nature of it all, what it does for us, and now it's just immortalized in time and place in San Francisco and in Hayes Valley. Actually, Rich
Tony,
Table
what was his name?
is the physical space.
Oh, really?
Gabriel Vidal.
Yeah.
And Lucia Prado was his mother. And yeah, the corner of, if you're familiar with Rich Table, the corner of, I believe, Hayes and Fell, that was Lucia's restaurant. And yeah, just vivid memories. We miss him dearly, but thank you for today's show.
Thanks for bringing him into the conversation. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, having been of that generation that was so devastated in San Francisco, those of us who, through some crazy circumstances, luck or whatever, happened to survive, I do feel a tremendous responsibility to try to tell the stories of the generation that didn't, of the people who didn't. I don't think we've ever adequately, I know that we haven't adequately addressed the effect of that pandemic in food and restaurants in San Francisco and elsewhere. The enormous loss that we suffered, and how it transformed restaurants, how it transformed American food, that a whole generation, a brilliant generation who pioneered American restaurants is gone. We lost that generation. I'm so glad that you were able to mention his name and to conjure him in this conversation. I feel really honored, and thank you for that.
I want to turn to a few comments that have come in. Kate writes, "The things I think of while listening to this conversation: New Dawn Cafe on 16th Street in San Francisco, circa 1990 to 1995. Broken mannequin, arty baby doll, campy tchotchke decor. The cook was queer, maybe trans woman, often in a frilly apron. Best home fries ever, and everyone was welcome, including the well-known street characters whom outsiders would tend to avoid. My partner and I are still trying to replicate those home fries." 2, lesbian potlucks in the 80s and 90s, which would always include at least one dish from the Moosewood Cookbook or Laurel's Kitchen. 3, in the 80s, I was in sort of butch hippie mode, and people at mealtimes would assume I was vegetarian, to which my response was, "No, I think you think I'm a lesbian." Usually I was right, and they had just equated the two. And 4, the patio cafe in the Castro with young, cute men serving in pink polo shirts. Well, let me get one more question. That's such a great comment, Kate, and let's make sure we leave it up. Kiki writes, "For me, queer food is embodied in the venerable upper Midwestern delicacy known as Queen Anne cherry salad. It is, of course, not really a salad because it has mini marshmallows, heavy whipping cream, Miracle Whip, and lots of canned fruit. The star of the show is, of course, the Royal Anne cherry, which my mother misnamed Queen Anne cherry. I moved to San Francisco in 1990 for law school, made a big double batch of it for a Thanksgiving party where it was ridiculed. Until people discovered it was an excellent topping for pumpkin pie, it has been a mainstay of queer camp celebrations here in the Bay ever since." So much in those. One thread I want to pull out for you, because I think you really address it beautifully in the book, is how camp like the varieties of camp that end up serving as entertainment but community building. Like, talk to me about camp and food.
Yeah, I mean, camp has been such an important influence on our food. I mean, some of the commenters there sort of describing some of the ways where this kind of exuberance about kind of putting together foods, some of which we remembered growing up. I also, in my book, I write about Ernest Matthew Meikler, who wrote White Trash Cooking, which was published in 1986. And Ernie passed away because of AIDS a couple of years later in 1988. White Trash Cooking becomes this unexpected hit. Ernie grew up in coastal Florida and basically had to leave, like many of his generation, had to leave the place where he was born and grew up in order to express himself, in order to be queer. He does spend time in San Francisco, but he writes this book, White Trash Cooking, that basically goes back to the kinds of communities where he grew up, where he was essentially exiled from, and kind of embraces this food, this Southern cooking that was based on a lot of canned ingredients and, pudding mixes and Jell-O. And instead of making fun of it, he uses camp to embrace it, to reclaim it. I love that idea of camp being used to reclaim places of exile. A place like coastal Florida where you could so easily make fun of people who live in trailers and the kind of people who wouldn't accept you for being queer, but kind of going back and saying, this is part of me. This is part of my queer identity, even if the people who still live here can't accept me. So it's really this loving tribute. I find that incredibly moving, how people were able to express difficult things through camp, not only joy and fun, but to go back home, as it were, by using camp as a way to embrace and elevate certain dishes, recipes, traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that is very difficult this time is, the Trump administration has been really quite specifically targeting people around, gender, sexuality, gender roles. Do you think there's a queer food response?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to write this book was to look at previous generations, to focus on previous generations and the way that though people couldn't express openly, though they couldn't come together in public spaces, they couldn't present themselves as they wanted to, as they needed to, they were able to survive. They were able to do it in the safe spaces that they could carve out. In my book, I talk about this series of lesbian potlucks that happened in New York City in the early 1950s, during the Lavender Scare, where people were afraid to go out to bars because they felt they would be spotted. Somebody would see them, going into a queer bar, and they'd be reported, they'd be fired. But the way people persevered, the way they created alternate forms to survive and thrive, is really drawn to, my sense of queerness, my definition of queerness is really influenced by a comment that Bell Hooks, the wonderful writer, once said when she was asked to define her sexuality. She said that she was queer. She considered herself queer not because of who she slept with, but in the sense of queerness as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it, and has to invent, has to create new creative ways to survive and to express itself. And in our current moment, so much of our history is being erased. Erasing a letter from LGBTQ photos and stories being disappeared from national archives, but still we can, we can thrive in new ways that we're just imagining now.
John Birdsall, thank you so much for joining us. The new book is What is Queer Food? I'm Alexis Madrigal. Stay tuned for another hour of Forum Ahead with Mina Kim.